Hello and welcome to a Firstpost POV. Our focus is on the Caribbean today, where tensions are rising between the United States and Venezuela. US President Donald Trump has deployed multiple warships, including a nuclear submarine, to the region, and he's also blown up Venezuelan so-called drug boats and killed at least 17 people. Now, new reporting in the US media suggests that Trump is also weighing a strike on Venezuelan soil against so-called drug targets. All this escalation makes you wonder, where are things going next, and is a full-scale war on the cards in the region? To try and understand some of these questions, let me introduce my guest, Mr. Mark Cancian, who's a retired US Marine colonel and also a senior advisor right now at the CSIS Defense and Security Department. Thank you so much, Mr. Cancian, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Let's talk about that dreaded word that everybody seems to be speaking right now, which is regime change. Do you think that could be one of the goals, perhaps, if things go to plan for the United States in the Caribbean, specifically in Venezuela?
I think that's very unlikely, regime change, because the United States is not assembling the kinds of forces that would be needed to overthrow the Venezuelan regime. It does have some 9 warships, some fighter aircraft, nuclear submarine, but only about 2,000 Marines. The Venezuelan army has something like 125,000 personnel. So to invade Venezuela would require a much, much larger force, 50,000, 100,000. The Pentagon would probably ask for 200,000 because they like to have overwhelming force. So I think that is unlikely. However, as you noted, it's possible to see missile strikes on cartel facilities in Venezuela, and I expect continuing attacks on alleged drug smuggling boats.
Right. You say that a regime change operation or an invasion is unlikely. That's a relief. But then let's talk about what the actual goal could be. We hear that it's about drug. Sometimes we hear that Trump is playing to his domestic audience with his rhetoric on immigration, illegal so-called immigration from Central America and Latin America. What do you think are the goals of this US military buildup and the strikes that we are seeing on Venezuelan targets?
I think the goals are twofold. With regards to Venezuela, it's just intimidation. That is, putting these forces there, maybe forcing the Venezuelans to adopt a more friendly attitude, more cooperative attitude to the United States. In terms of counter-drug, there's no question this is a major initiative of the Trump administration, and counter-drug has been very bipartisan in the United States. Both parties recognize the problems that drug smuggling causes. Some of it is political theater, that is Trump making the point that he's going to do something dramatic about drug smuggling. Some of it is about interdicting, these drug smuggling boats, or at least interdicting a small number of them.
Does he have enough military in the region right now to achieve those goals that you mentioned? For instance, deterring these alleged drug boats from entering American waters, perhaps going to American ports and smuggling drugs. Does he have enough military in the region to achieve those goals?
It depends on what you define as the goal. President Trump, of course, tends to be very expansive, and we're going to stop the smuggling of drugs. Stopping it entirely is impossible. There's always ways for drug smugglers to get through. On the other hand, he can make it a little harder for them. Long term, the United States is going to need a broader approach to counter drugs. The military alone isn't sufficient. The military is also a very poor tool for counter drugs because it doesn't have law enforcement capabilities or authorities. The Coast Guard is a much better tool. The United States is expanding the Coast Guard, and over the long term, I think that's the solution.
You touched upon authority there, and that's a relevant question to ask here, because these strikes are happening unilaterally. There's no trial, there's no proof being submitted that these are so-called drug vessels or that the people on these boats are drug smugglers. But the United States has carried out multiple strikes, killing, like I mentioned, 17 civilians, foreigners, on international waters. Is there any legal basis for conducting these strikes, or is it just Trump saying, I'm the big player here and I'll do whatever I want?
There's a lot of debate in the United States about whether the administration does have the legal authority to conduct these strikes. As you point out, there's no judicial process. Many people have criticized these as summary executions. The Trump administration argues that its authorities to repel terrorism is sufficient to cover these strikes. That's certainly a stretch. I expect that this will end up in the courts, and eventually the Supreme Court will make a decision.
Now let's look at it from the other side. What are the Venezuelans doing? We've seen they've held some military drills close to the coast. There have also been reports of the Maduro regime essentially giving weapons, guns to ordinary civilians and training them in case things go bad. We know that the Venezuelans can't stand up to the Americans in a conventional war. So what would be the thinking in Caracas right now? What's the best strategy for Venezuela?
I think the Venezuelans are trying to signal that any invasion would be very difficult, that it would start an insurgency, that the people will be armed, and that the United States could end up in a forever war as it did in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Trump administration is particularly sensitive to not getting into an extended conflict, and that's what the Venezuelans are trying to signal.
Now, let's also talk about what sort of impact these strikes will have. Let's face it, Maduro is not a popular leader. His recent elections were very clearly rigged against his opponents. But do you feel that these strikes could perhaps rally his people behind him? We saw that with the case of the tariffs, for instance. The Canadian ruling party was set to lose, then came Trump's tariffs, and suddenly the people rallied against the common enemy, which was Donald Trump. Do you fear that something like that could happen in Venezuela and essentially make this strategy counterproductive?
I'm not an expert in Venezuelan politics, so it's very hard to say. Certainly, we saw that dynamic in Canada and Australia. On the other hand, Maduro is extremely unpopular, and it's possible that this might energize the opposition. And Maduro clearly his regime is very fragile. Hard to predict what would happen.
What about the role of possible foreign players? We know that Venezuela is close to Russia and China. A lot of the investments into their energy sector comes from the Chinese. I think the Russians released a statement at the UNGA saying they're alarmed by these US strikes on the Venezuelan boats. Do you see these countries going beyond mere statements of condemnation, or do you think they'll just condemn and let the Americans deal this out in the Caribbean?
Russia and China are not going to get more involved. This is the United States backyard. It's very close to our shores, and it's allegedly about drugs. And Russia and China don't want to appear to be supporting the international drug trade in the cartel. So they'll be critical, but they won't make any moves.
I also wonder what this means for Trump's broader Latin American strategy, because there's clearly a trend emerging. We saw in Brazil, where he is clearly preferring one guy, Jair Bolsonaro, and imposing tariffs on Brazil. In Argentina, we are hearing that they're trying to bail out the regime of Javier Milei. And now we are seeing this happening in Venezuela. Would you say there is an aggressive and renewed push in American foreign policy towards Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, a perhaps aggressive revival of the old Monroe Doctrine, or would that be a stretch right now?
I don't think that's really a stretch. What we're waiting for is what's called the National Defense Strategy, and that will lay out what the Trump administration is trying to do in the region very explicitly. The reports about that strategy, which apparently is about to be signed, is that it will focus the U.S. attention on Homeland Security and the hemisphere. So that would indicate increased attention to Central and Latin America. What that means for forces, hard to say. Would this be a new enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine? Hard to say. The President Trump's policies tend to be very one-on-one, not regional-wide, but his response to the actions of particular countries or particular personalities. So a little hard to say at this point.
Do you foresee this happening in other Latin American countries, though? Perhaps he's had complaints against countries like Colombia, for instance, about other things like illegal migration. Do you feel that this use of military or US hard power in the Caribbean to achieve his political goals, do you see that as something that he will try in some other country as well after Venezuela?
I don't see hard power being used elsewhere, but I do see economic and soft power being used. And we've seen that with Colombia. That is, Trump threatened to increase tariffs if Colombia did not take back some of its immigrants. And I expect that we'll see more instances like that, not hard military power.
And where exactly is this policy push coming from? I read a piece recently which squarely put the blame on Marco Rubio and essentially said that he's got Latin American heritage, he's got his own grievances against socialist and left-leaning regimes in South America, and therefore he is effectively leading this American push in the region. Is that true? Is this something that the Secretary of State / National Security Advisor is leading, or is this a Trump White House-wide Trumpian phenomenon?
This is a White House-led phenomenon. Now, Secretary Rubio has been implementing it, and I think he supports it. But these are actions and approaches that Trump has been talking about for a long time. Very anti-immigration, very much trying to eliminate illegal immigration and drugs also. He's talked about that many times in the past. So these initiatives, I think, come from the president himself and the White House.
Right. Finally, let's just touch upon the military situation. How do you see the strikes evolving later on? Do we see more strikes on vessels and then on land targets, or do you think the White House has made up its mind to go after targets on mainland Venezuela?
I don't think they've made a decision to go after targets on mainland Venezuela, but you could certainly see that. In that case, you would see attacks on cartel facilities, maybe in rural areas where they're producing illegal drugs. Very unlikely you would see attacks directly on the Maduro regime. You'll certainly see continued attacks on drug boats. We've seen at least 3 attacked so far. What you won't see are any U.S. forces on the ground in Venezuela. That's considered very risky, be very easy for something to go wrong and American to be held captive. And as I said, you won't see an invasion.
Well, let's hope you're right, and the strikes or the operations are limited to what's happening right now, or perhaps not even to that, because like you mentioned, there is a lot of debate around whether these strikes are legally okay for a country to launch upon a neighbor of its without any proof, without any trial or a due process. Let's see how things unfold in the Caribbean, but in the meantime, thank you so much, Mr. Mark Cancian, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Firstpost now available in 9 languages on YouTube. English,
Stands at $36 trillion.
French,
Le FMI, comme
German,
geschäftsführenden Direktor
Hindi,
$30 trillion ka karjo.
Indonesian,
Pemerintah tanpa pemeriksaan.
Italian,
Sekali radikali.
Japanese,
$4 idioma.
Portuguese,
Por causa do próprio balanço patrimonial.
Spanish.
Beautiful bill.
Go to Settings, click on Audio Track and select the language of your choice. Be the first to know what's happening around you in your first language. Firstpost.